to a group of teachers yesterday about poetry and analysis of poetry. And we talked about, in the multiple genre strand, it talks about the use of repetition. And so the question to them was, so why does an author use repetition? We have to be able to answer that. What effect does that have in a poem? And I think we need to get deeper into our own content knowledge of in that poem that we have, even if it's, I can't say even if it's Shel Silverstein, because that's really good poetry. Even if it's something that somebody might say, oh, this is little kid stuff. Shel Silverstein uses repetition on purpose to establish a rhythm. Like a master, to replicate and create imagery of maybe a horse galloping, or to really imitate maybe how the heart beats and how that rhythm is going and accelerating throughout the poem with the repetition. There's reasons why poets do the things they do.
That Shel Silverstein poem becomes The Highwayman. Mm-hmm. What Tennyson, am I right? What Tennyson does with Talat, 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 the highwayman came riding, Talat, 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 Talat. And you hear the gallop because you studied Shel Silverstein. Yeah. So it has to start somewhere.
I think it does. But I think also in looking at B, no, let me see. I think it's E. Identify and analyze the use of literary devices, including multiple points of view and irony. This connects us back to composition and multiple genres. So if I'm looking at a particular thing that I've written, I wrote about, let's say, Tail. I named my dog Tail. I was 2. But I can write about that story from my point of view. But I can also write it from Tail's point of view. I can also write it from my mother's point of view. But then I have to look at it and juxtapose those points of view and have to pull back and say, which one is going to best tell the story so that my reader can see what I say and understand what I mean. And it's that kind of thing that it brings us back to how someone uses those author's purpose and craft choices about point of view for their own compositions and products and performances. It's whenever we begin to have kids working with those things and trying out points of view on their own and then getting them to that point, because it says identify and analyze. I'm just not pointing out point of view. I'm talking about what impact that had on the piece itself and on the impact it had on the reader. Because eventually I've got to get up into, like with D, to where we critique. Was that done well?
Shona brings up a good point that we need to remember to drive home. This is a standard, she was referencing E, that includes, across the grade bands, 2 different words. It's either including or such as. So when a standard uses the word including, that should be part of a direct teach. That is something that the teacher is required to teach. If the standard uses the word such as, those are simply suggestions. So whatever follows such as is not a checkbox, is not a list that we check off and go, I have taught oxymoron in English 1. I am finished. So we have to make sure that the such as's don't become a checkbox and that the including is taught to mastery and is taught. These standards are recursive. These are not one and done standards. I say a lot of times, I'm not a science teacher. I don't just teach the phases of the moon in 4th grade. And I'm finished with the phases of the moon. Great science teachers apply those to other pieces. I'm not finished with explain the author's purpose and message within a text in grade 8, and I'm finished. I've done it once, and I'm done with 9A. I have to do 9A all of the time. We start this standard at A, kindergarten A, discuss with adult assistants the author's purpose for writing a text. I look at the progression that the teams did, and I end at grade 12, G. Analyze the effects of rhetorical devices and logical fallacies on the way a text is read and understood. And I love the poem Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. and the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not as they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not the goal. Dust thou art, to dust returneth, was not spoken of the soul. So I hear that poem, and I know how it should be read, and I know how it should be understood. But there was a criminal on death row who recited that poem just before his execution. And that was Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. So now that text is read and understood differently. And I'm looking at author's purpose and craft, and Longfellow didn't intend for it to do that. So that's not his purpose. But I look at his craft, and I look at what somebody else did to it as they read it, and how that changes understanding. And so the context changes because the poem was used, recited in a different way. So we move from discuss how it was written to how it should be read and understood. And we talk about the 21st century changes to these standards. And there's a lot at work here, and there's a lot that teachers have to do here. So we have our work cut out for us when we go back to work with teachers. But this is a strand that you camp out in, that you use as formative assessment, that you say, how are we going to do this differently?
I think what we've all kind of touched on is the idea of mentor texts. And we model with a mentor text as teachers. If I'm looking at, let's go with Hamlet because it's fun. If I'm looking at Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, I can use that soliloquy over and over again. And then I can ask them questions about their own text that they've chosen. And so you start with a model, and then you formatively assess with their own text, which makes it authentic, which was what was in the introduction. So we've repeated it over and over, but I think it needs to be said again. These texts are recursive. They're interconnected. These strands and these teaks are recursive and interconnected, and you can't have one without the other. And the formative assessments come through discussion. You have to know what came before you so that you can ask those questions, and if they can discuss, then move them to explain, then move them to analyze. And so those are the formative assessments. Use their authentic books, but model it first.
So the use of mentor texts is so important, like you said right now, right? Because we have to, as teachers, be selecting quality literature to be able to lean into and learn from. But the other thing I just thought about too is a practice we have let go of a little bit, at least I haven't seen it as much, as author studies. And so in author studies, we get to see multiple pieces from the same author and learn what are some of the tools that they consistently reach for, and how do I want to emulate that author and try those things out in my piece. And so I love that.
So Chris Barton is a Texas author, and when I think about the changes in standards, I think about highlighting Texas authors, and this is a Texas author writing about a Texas luminary. So his book is about Barbara Jordan, and just what you could do with a Chris Barton study if I camp out in an author, and I take his picture books and I take his middle grade books, and I look at what that author does, but I also make it Texas applicable. And I think about what fourth grade Texas history needs to do and seventh grade Texas history needs to do. We start crossing curricular lines that way, and we talk about author's purpose, and we bring it home to Texas, and we make it real.
I think what I like about this strand, and it's not necessarily just in the classroom, but it really is, we're creating problem solvers. We're not just talking about something and not knowing where to go from there. Then we can explain, we can analyze, and then evaluate. So that's, I think, my biggest excitement is that we have so many kiddos that, they get to the end of the road and they don't know where to go. And I think with the TEKS in literature or in life in general, we're just going to create problem solvers. And I think that.
What excites me about this strand is that we're growing readers into writers. And when I think about me growing up and having a mom as an educator, and how that really helped me when I got to college, because every single class I had to write a paper. I don't know if I could have done that if I wasn't a good reader, and if I didn't understand points of view, if I didn't understand how and why the author chose to do that. So when I think about this, going from kindergarten to 12th grade, I'm excited to see my kinder babies move up to 12th grade and the things and the products that they create and how they're able to become that writer and how that skill transfers over into life. If we're going to create lifelong readers and writers, here's where we start. What's the purpose? We set the stage with what's the purpose?